Okay, my name is Bev Scott, and today we're going to cover the bones of the skull. This is for the Second Knowledge Festival. So in just looking at this skull, we're looking at the anterior view of the skull. You can see the facial bones, the orbit of the eye, the mandible. Then turn it, and here is the lateral view of the skull. Here we can see the temporal bone, the zygomatic arch, the external auditory meatus. And then from the posterior view, we see the occiput and the parietal bones. Then if we were to turn the skull upside down, we'll take the mandible off, and now we can see the inferior view of the skull with the foramen magnum. We're going to take the calvarium or lid off the skull. This is referred to as the calvarium. It's the cover to the skull. And then looking inside the skull, we see various holes and divisions, which we'll cover. Okay, so starting off, looking at the front of the skull, we're first going to talk about the frontal bone. You can see it right here at the forehead is part of the frontal bone, and the frontal bone also forms part of the orbit. Okay. This is what the frontal bone looks like by itself. Okay, here's where the eyebrows go. Here's the roof of the orbit. If we turn it sideways, you can see that it forms the coronal suture here. It links up with the parietal bone. If we turn it inside, you can see this is the top of the orbit, and this is the inside of the forehead. Okay, so let's break down each individual part. We have this, which is the squamous portion. Squamous means flat. So this whole forehead is referred to as the squamous portion of the occiput. Coming down, you can see these bony ridges. This is where the eyebrows are. This is called the supraciliary arch. Coming down right before you get into the orbit, this is referred to as the orbital margin. And within the orbital margin, you'll find either a hole or a notch. And because the orbit is the frame of reference, this is referred to as the supraorbital foramen if it's a hole, and supraorbital notch if it's a open, if it's a hole that hasn't been closed. Then we're going to move into the internal features of the frontal bone. And what you'll see here is the frontal crest. Another internal feature of this is there are some paired nasal sinuses called paranasal sinuses, and the frontal sinuses sit within the bone right on either side of the center of the frontal bone. So opening it up this way, here is the frontal crest right here. It sort of divides the frontal bone into right and left halves. Okay, and the frontal sinuses sit here. There's a really good skull to see a picture of the frontal sinuses. This one right here. You see this darkened area right here? We're pretty sure this is from someone who smoked, and the sinuses have been darkened. You can see a little bit on this side here. Okay, so that takes care of the frontal bone. The next bone we're going to cover are the parietal bones. Okay, the parietal bones form the lateral walls here of the skull. They're divided in half by the sagittal suture, and they meet the frontal bone on the anterior side, and they meet the occiput on the posterior side. Okay, they just look like this. They're a set of paired bones. Okay, like this. Okay, and the only thing you have to know about these, besides that they're the parietal bones, is that they have these lines that run sort of parallel to the bone below it, which is the temporal bone. The temporal bone is right here. And these lines that run alongside of the parietal bone are called the temporal lines. The highest one is the superior temporal line, and the one below it is the inferior temporal line. Okay, so parietal bones are a paired bone. The next bone we're going to cover is the occiput. Okay? The occiput is at the inferior part of the skull and the back of the skull. It houses the important hole, the foramen magnum, for the spinal cord. Okay, this is what it looks like as an individual bone. Okay, and this part here joins with the sphenoid bone. So what do we look for on the occipital bone? External features. We have the external occipital protuberance, and coming lateral off that in a horizontal direction are the superior nuchal lines, and then below that, where the hairline is on the human, this is the inferior nuchal line. The occiput also has a squamous or flat portion, the back of the head. Then we come looking from the inferior aspect, and these are the occipital condyles, and that's what the atlas sits on. This here that joins with the sphenoid bone, this is referred to as the basilar portion of the occiput. Okay. Internal features of the occiput. If this was the external occipital protuberance, this is the internal occipital protuberance. And going horizontal off of that internal occipital protuberance is the groove for the transverse sinus. It's just going all the way as far as you can go with your finger, and then once it gets to that bony mass, there's an S-shaped slide that dumps into the jugular foramen. Groove for the transverse sinus, and then groove for the sigmoid sinus on both sides. Groove for the transverse sinus, groove for the sigmoid sinus, and it dumps into the jugular foramen. There's holes associated with this bone, the major one being the foramen magnum, which means large hole. Coming from the posterior aspect of the skull, right before we get to the condyles, there's a indentation or a depression. One side, you notice, there's no hole, there's just this depression. This is the condylar fossa. This side actually has a hole. So this side would be referred to as the condyloid canal. Okay, again, it's coming from the posterior aspect, just posterior to the condyles. The next hole associated with this, the last one, this one is the hypoglossal canal. And this hole goes underneath the condyle, crossing it midline, okay? Whereas the condyloid canal is coming from the longitudinal side of it, the inferior aspect, going along the long part of the condyle. The hypoglossal canal bisects through the middle of the condyle, okay? So foramen magnum, condyloid canal, condylar fossa because there's no hole, and hypoglossal canal. Okay, so that takes care of the occipital bone. The next bone is the temporal bone. So we see the temporal bone from the lateral side of the skull here. You can see it from the inferior aspect too, right here. And from the inside, you can see it has this bony prominence inside. So the temporal bone has one of the thinnest areas here, the squamous part, as well as one of the thickest part of the skull. It's thick here because it's housing the internal acoustic meatus, or the inner ear, and the workings of the inner ear. Again, it's a paired bone, one on each side. It forms with the zygomatic bone to form the zygomatic arch. You can see here, here's our ear, our external auditory meatus. So let's talk about the different parts. Okay, paired bone. This is what the temporal bone looks like by itself. This is the external part. You can see how thin this squamous portion is compared to this bony just bony cave that's protecting the inner ear. And here's part of the process that forms the zygomatic arch. Okay, so this is the squamous part, or the flat part of the bone. This is a mastoid air cell called a mastoid process. This here, take the red off. This is the styloid process. So mastoid process, styloid process. This process, it joins with the zygomatic bone, so this is referred to, just this part right here is the zygomatic process, named for what it articulates with. If we turn it upside down, we can see this mastoid process, styloid process, zygomatic process. This little indentation right here, this is going to be for the articulation with the mandible, and it's a fossa, so named for what it articulates with, it's the mandibular fossa. Now the internal features. Again, squamous can be external as well as internal. It just means flat. So this could be the squamous portion. Looking inside, the main thing we notice here is this bony mountainous region. This is the petrous portion. Petrous means rock in Greek. So this is the rock-like projection here. Petrous portion. There's one on each side. And it's also listed under the temporal bone, this groove for the sigmoid sinus. It's kind of where the occiput and the temporal bone come together to form this sort of S-shaped groove for the sigmoid sinus. So it's listed under both the occiput and the temporal bone. Okay, now let's talk about the holes of the occiput. First, on the lateral side, we have the opening for the external auditory meatus, also called external acoustic meatus. From the inferior aspect, we see a hole between the mastoid process and the styloid process. It's closer to the styloid, so we call it stylomastoid foramen. Foramen meaning hole. We saw the jugular foramen because this groove for the sigmoid sinus ends up dumping into this jugular foramen. So we have stylomastoid foramen. Jugular foramen is the most posterior on the temporal bone. Next we have the carotid foramen right here. So jugular foramen, carotid foramen, stylomastoid foramen. Okay. Now, where this temporal bone joins with the sphenoid bone, right here, temporal bone, sphenoid bone, there's a bony canal that's created. You can see two bones joining together. And where that bony canal comes together, that is the opening for the eustachian tube, okay, or auditory tube. That's that pressure chamber when you go up in an airplane. So eustachian tube opening, that opening when the temporal bone joins with the sphenoid bone. And if I were to push this pipe cleaner from medial to lateral, it would end up coming out the external auditory meatus. Okay, so those are the holes on the outside. Now let's look from the inside and see what we can find. In the posterior portion of the petrous portion here, we can see, I'll put it in from the other side. Here's the jugular foramen right here. And then on the posterior side of the petrous portion, this is the internal acoustic or internal auditory meatus. Posterior side of the petrous portion. Climb over this mountain to the other side, going from medial to lateral. There's a bony canal. This bony canal is the carotid canal. So it goes in as the carotid canal, and where it comes out is the carotid foramen. So external inferior view, carotid foramen, internal, going from medial to lateral, carotid canal. So those are the holes associated with the temporal bone. The next bone is the sphenoid bone. Okay, the sphenoid bone sits in this middle cranial fossa. It's this seat here, the sides of the middle cranial fossa. We can see it here on the lateral aspect. We can see another part of the sphenoid here. When we look into the orbit of the eye, sort of the lateral walls of the orbit are formed by part of the sphenoid. We turn this skull upside down. These are the sort of the feet or the pterygoids of the sphenoid bone. And remember, we said the basilar portion joins with the sphenoid bone. This is the greater wing of the sphenoid. So we can see it from many different views of the skull. This is what the sphenoid bone looks like before it is sutured to many other bones of the skull. Okay, so it's divided into lesser wings here. These are the greater wings here. These are the pterygoids here. This is the body, and within the body there are paired sinuses. Okay, so where do we see this in the body, in the skull? Okay, if we look at it this way, we can see this, the orbital portion, right here. Okay, here, this part right here, we see right here on the lateral part of the skull, right above the zygomatic bone. If we look inside the skull, we see this Turkish saddle, or sella turcica, right here. This is the home of the pituitary gland. That's where the pituitary gland sits. And these lesser wings fuse with the frontal bone, sort of like, if I can, let's see. I need a Lego. That's what I want, is a Lego to put these together with. But this part here fuses with the frontal bone anteriorly. So we're not seeing this whole thing represented, but see how it's fused to this frontal bone here. Okay, so that's how it sits. Okay, and then here, this part is going to fuse with the paired temporal bone. Okay, inferior aspect, we can see these pterygoids. Need another hand. These pterygoids here, represented here. So they form sort of the posterior lateral wall of the nasal septum there. Okay? All right, so let's talk about the different parts of this bone. So lesser wings, and then this part here is the greater wing, all of this. So if this was on a knowledge festival and I asked you to identify this piece right here, you'd know it was the sphenoid bone, but what part of the sphenoid bone? The greater wing. This part here and here, this represents the lesser wing. In here, this part here is the greater wing, all the way out to the side. Then it joins here with the temporal bone. From this part, these that hang down from the body of the sphenoid, these are called the pterygoid processes. There's sides to each of the processes as well as a fossa in the middle. So the lateral sides of these pterygoids are referred to lateral lamellae. Remember, lamellae means little plate, so lateral lamellae. And then the inside plates of these pterygoids are the medial lamellae. You can also call them lateral pterygoid plate, medial pterygoid plate, or lateral lamellae, medial lamellae. And in between these pterygoid plates or lamellae is the pterygoid fossa. So they kind of look like chaps that a cowboy might wear. And where your thighs would fit into these chaps, that is the pterygoid fossa. Okay, so that's the leg part. You can't visualize the body too well except on this skull. I don't know if you can look back into the posterior aspect of the nose. You can see two black holes. And that is where the sinuses or the body of the sphenoid are. And you can see they're destroyed with smoke. We're assuming it's that this person was a smoker. So the sinuses are all black. So that's a really good visual of this sphenoid sinus that normally you can't see. Now, let's talk about this. This sella turcica, or Turkish saddle, is the little saddle. It looks like a saddle. Here's the back of the saddle, the front of the saddle. The legs go down in here. Peggy Phillips made up this great story that I like to use, and she referred to this as a bed, and she broke down all the parts of the Turkish saddle, referring them to different bed parts of a four-poster bed. So that's what I always use. So attached to, we'll do it on this first, attached to this model, attached to the lesser wing, you can see these tips right here, this tip and this tip. This is the anterior post on the four-poster bed, and it's referred to as the anterior clinoid process. These are the posterior posts on this four-poster bed, and these are the posterior clinoid processes. So anterior clinoid processes, posterior clinoid processes. This right here is the pillow on the bed, and this is referred to as the optic chiasm. Right in here, the deepest part where the pituitary glands sit, or the mattress, this is the hypophyseal fossa, because another name for pituitary is also hypophysis. So this mattress where the hypophyseal gland, which is about as big as the tip of your baby finger, is the hypophyseal fossa. And then this is the foot of the bed here, which joins with, this joins with the occiput, or the basilar portion of the occiput, just like that. This part is referred to as the dorsum sellae. And how do you know in a skull when you're going from the basilar portion of the occiput to the dorsum sellae? The basilar portion is pretty smooth, and as soon as you get to a roughened area, then you know you're at the dorsum sellae of the sphenoid bone. Okay? So this is the foot of the bed, or the dorsum sellae. These are the posterior clinoid processes, which sit at the superior aspect of the dorsum sellae. These are the anterior clinoid processes. One is broken off, so anterior clinoid process, the other one was here. This here